A lot of the fights that you see, I think in a lot of these films, why they're shaky and why they're inserts and why they've got this energy, the camera, is because a lot of times you are using actors that have no idea what they're doing. Everything changed a lot in action movies with the way it's portrayed. One of the reasons being that people just get bored. By the way, it doesn't mean that what we were doing in the 70s and 80s isn't good. It's just that when they've seen it all, they go, oh, okay, I've seen all that. What else can you do? You saw that with Steven Seagal, with his Aiki. When he first started the Aiki, we hadn't seen that before. Somebody with his hands down here and guys flipping through the air. And after a while, though, even then they go, okay, well, we've seen it. What else can you do? Hence, he starts to kick and punch and, do something different. Van Damme was the same. It got to a stage where, yes, we know you can do the splits, but what else can you do? Does that make sense? So, what Aid is saying, this film was made how long, when was it released? 1990. God help me, it's a long time ago. So I still feel very good for what we were trying to do at the time we were doing it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, everything goes to like an extreme, but then starts to revert back. Like even the world of bodybuilding, for example, I mean, I think the physiques with Arnold's day in the 80s looked amazing. Then you have the mass monsters like Dorian Yates and those guys in the 90s. And they get so extreme, it kind of takes away because they almost push it too far. That's why like the classic physique, probably the most popular bodybuilder right now is Chris Bumstead. He's more of that, like, I forget what the weight classes are, but it's classic physique. So he's not just this mass monster. It kind of brings the aesthetics and the symmetry back, and he still kind of looks like a real person, compared to the open division. So I feel like maybe the action genre, probably the same way. It's like, okay, how much more can they push things? And then they start taking real physics out of it where they use wire work, or even these days, they'll use, probably AI, but they use CGI, for example. But it gets to that point where you take the realism out of it because these are still supposed to be real people in our world, unless you're doing the Matrix or something, obviously. But so when you start, like, the physics start breaking reality, it just doesn't register and it comes across as fake. So, I kind of feel like a lot of action films will kind of go back what they did in the 80s and 90s, where there's that realism to it. It's not like too extreme or over the top. You could appreciate, like, these are brutal, these are real moves. I think some things just get too ridiculous. I always use that bodybuilding analogy.
No, you're right. But if you look at Octagon that I did with Chuck, that sword fight that we had in the end, when I was Keo, the master enforcer, and I fight Chuck with the sai. And eventually, the katana, and then I get kicked through the flames. Harmoniously. But if you look at the way that was shot, that was all wide, it was pretty much a continuous master. We didn't go in for tight shots and inserts. There was no shaky camera, and that was a style back then. And I really appreciate that when I look at something like that, because if you look at a lot of Bruce Lee's End of the Dragon, a lot of that was reasonably wide. Why? Because you had somebody who was that good at what they did. You could afford to pull back, see where a kick started from the ground, where it ended up, and where it landed back on the ground. In other words, you didn't have to trick it up. And I think that's a lot of the fights that you see, I think in a lot of these films, why they're shaky and why they're inserts and why they've got this energy, the camera, is because a lot of times you are using actors that have no idea what they're doing. So a lot of it is to basically disguise that fact. And with Mad Max, an example of what you're saying, when we did Fury Road, the big message from George Miller is this is real. He didn't want anyone, whether it's Tom Hardy or a Charlize, to be flipping a weapon. He said, why would you twirl a weapon in the middle of combat and risk dropping it, for instance? It's not about a show. So the dictum to all of us and me as a fight coordinator is everything is real. It was about getting the job done in the most efficient way possible. And I think, looking back look at Bruce Lee with his nunchaku. Yes, he did the nunchaku with slave, but remember the actual fights was just bam, one powerful hit, one powerful post, which resonates with real martial artists to see the intent and everything in the use of the weapon, where it wasn't just about putting on a ridiculous show, And I would argue that people like George are trying to bring back old school filmmaking with the Mad Maxes that he didn't want, and still in even with Furiosa that we finished recently, no superfluous movement. Is about efficiency, getting the job done, which, let's face it, anybody in the real combat world, that's the whole point. It's not to look good, it's to survive and actually come out the other end, being the victor. And so I would hope that what you're saying is true, that we're getting back to a little bit more reality-based choreography and execution of fight scenes in movies. Flip side, I get that it's still a movie. It's that you're there to entertain the audiences, and a lot of people don't know actual combat, so you can get away with a lot. But it's still, again, it's just nice to stay true to the real essence and heart of what the martial arts were originally meant to be.
Well, that was one of the things that really appealed to me, Rich, was the fact that when we did the Chai fight, the mock-up fight by the river in the village, having you and Covid fight, and like Octagon, be able to have the ability to just stand back and let the fighters do it. It's like having Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, the dance moves. You didn't have to cut in because they could do it all.
You saying I was the Ginger Rogers in that fight scene?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's that tradition of not having to cut in when you can see people can really do what the skill requires. And the only time we do cut in, if you pay attention, it's really character-driven moments. And but the fight pieces themselves, it was, for me, I think it was pretty brutal, because I think from memory, Rich, that you and Covid ended up with a lot of bruises. There was a lot of contact in that Thai kickboxing fight.
Yeah, and again, to finish that off, and again, you look at that fight, there's nothing flashy about it. It's just, it was still about getting the job done rather than putting on a demonstration display. And by the way, if you were going to do a whole fight involving ridiculous spinning heel kicks, I'm not the one. That was never my style. I was more of a hand fighter. The idea of using legs was, again, from working doors and doing bodyguard work. I wanted to just have a repertoire of what would actually get me through a real life situation. So I wasn't that interested in the high kicks and everything else. But again, that's just a matter of style. But yeah, I mean, so it was basic, and why not just show the basicness and make it work for the story and for the character? Because that's the other thing, people got to realize when we do these fight scenes in movies, everything is based on story and character. And when I say character, you have to, or you should be choreographing everything in line with the character and their background and believability. Like if you looked at Harley Quinn, and I worked with Margot for Mad Max, it was always, yes, she was a gymnast, and she was very athletic and all of that, but she wasn't a superhero. She couldn't run up walls, she couldn't do what Olympic gymnasts would do. So everything you choreograph has got to be in line with those character traits. I always say with fights, if people remember Dirty Harry and Clint Eastwood, I'd say if you saw Clint Eastwood in a fight suddenly do a jumping, spinning back kick, stunt double, you might say, yeah, that looks good, but basically say, well, how the fuck would he know how to do that? Do you know what I mean? So you want to keep it quite real in line with story and character, and I think that's very important. And I think, again, there's a lot of films getting back to that. But having said that, when you look at people like Scott Adkins and Michael J. White, these are incredible martial artists that are taking it to a whole different level, not only of skill set, but believability. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
We were talking about character. I was always impressed with Richard's use of the sai.
Oh, it was great in the Sword of Bushido.
And
the whole village clapping.
Well, that was
they were the only ones.
But it was one of those things that impressed me as a filmmaker and as a person, the ability that Rich has with the sai. And I thought, how can we incorporate this into the movie? And we never established that he travels with them. So it was one of those things that we set up by using it in the village, so that later on in the movie, when he's putting them into his boots for the final assault on the Yamaguchi's mansion, they would be justified. So introducing them as a throwaway exercise in the village, and then having the kids clap, was just a way of easing in that aspect of the movie, so that later on it would make sense that he has them and he knows how to use them, and people would accept it instantly. But then seeing them used in the practical sense versus doing the exercise, then you realize how lethal those things are.
Sure, for sure.